So welcome, Karan. I thought we might begin by asking you about something very large, the fate of Indian democracy. India, when it emerged as an independent country in 1947, and for many decades thereafter, was known and still advertises itself as the world's largest democracy, largest not least because of the size of its population. But more recently, this reputation has taken a beating. And what I wanted to ask you is whether what we are seeing is a kind of decline, gradual decline of Indian democracy, or whether in fact what we might judge as populism and authoritarianism actually emerge at the very moment when democracy in India is actually expanding in the sense of including more and more categories of people in it. So when you think about the early years of Indian independence, with independence, you move from a very limited colonial style, nevertheless multi-party representative system to effectively a one-party state. And then when new political parties start emerging and reaching into the heartland, you have a kind of attempt to shut down, for instance, in Indira Gandhi's emergency, and then again in the 1990s with the emergence of caste politics and religious politics, you have another kind of shutdown. Does that seem to be a more likely story for Indian democracy and the perils to it, that the perils actually emerge at the very moment when the political sphere is opening up?
I would say, Faisal, both ends of the alternatives that you offer are correct, but the sad part is they're not really an either-or option. There is a genuine decline in Indian democracy, not just in the technical sense that Parliament functions for a very limited period and the amount of time it functions each year seems to be decreasing. The voice of the opposition is inherently ignored by the government. And in fact, to be honest, the voice of the opposition is ineffective even if it were not to be ignored. There are several shortcuts that are happening in the sense that the functioning of independent institutions like the Election Commission has weakened. The extent to which that they can be pressurized by the government has grown. The media is, to use the Indian colloquialism, that is the pet phrase, a godi media, which means that it behaves like the lapdog, literally sitting in the lap of the government. Very few independent voices actually stand up and criticize the government. Most television channels tend to defer to the government. The Prime Minister, when and if he's interviewed, and he's interviewed pretty rarely, is done so on bended knee. He gives the longest answers possible. He is never challenged. Instead of being questioned about what has gone wrong on his jurisdiction, he's instead given an opportunity to criticize the opposition. So in a variety of ways where they're talking about the functioning of Parliament, the functioning of the opposition, the functioning of the media, and you could add to that even the functioning of the judiciary or independent institutions, there is absolutely no doubt that the quality of Indian democracy has not just declined, but very sharply, and it continues to decline almost every single week. However, there is a flip side. And that flip side does not necessarily have to contradict with what has happened, but unfortunately in this instance it does. And the flip side is that consciousness of political processes has seeped down to a level of the population where previously it did not exist. People are much more aware of the power of the vote. There is no doubt that in 1977, when Indira Gandhi was voted out, they were very conscious that the capacity to vote against her was giving them back a power that she had taken. But that consciousness dissipated over the remaining 4 decades thereafter. It's now back again in people's minds. But what has happened is that this time, that consciousness has been awakened by a call to nationalism and a heightened consciousness and concern that somehow India is at risk, surrounded by its neighbors in this particular part of the world, that only Mr. Modi can secure the country and its borders. China and Pakistan in particular are constant threats. And that concern with nationalism has awoken and brought to the fore a political choice that many people previously hadn't considered necessary. At the same time, what's happened side by side is also a call to Hindutva, awakening of the consciousness of people that they are Hindus, sometimes Hindus first before they are Indians, Hindus first before they are Gujaratis or Malayalis or Tamils, or more likely from the north, Madhya Pradeshis, UPites and Biharis. And it is the awakening of political consciousness on the grounds of nationalism and on the grounds of Hindutva or Hindu consciousness that is making politics more vibrant, but also taking it lower down to levels of people where previously they were not so aware and conscious of it. And it's sad that the two are happening as polar opposites. The decline of the actual functioning of democracy, of choice, of tolerance, of secularism, alongside with the awakening of the fact that people now believe that they need to vote to save India's identity, to save India's religion, to save India's culture. And so what happens is that at one end, you have an inferiority complex where the majority, that is 80%, actually believes it is threatened by the 14, 15, 16% Muslims, which is an impossibility, but it is a perceived reality. And on the other side, you actually have the technical functioning of democracy, which has hollowed out. So yes, India remains, in a very technical sense, the biggest democracy in the world, because every 5 years, pretty close to 900 million people, I think it will be 900 million people by 2024, will have the technical right to vote. Sometimes up to 67, 68% of that number do vote. It's a huge exercise, and in a technical sense, there is no doubt there is democracy. From time to time, there are opposition voices that speak out, there are newspapers that criticize, and all of that confirms that in a technical sense, it's a democracy. But when you look at the other side of the equation and you discover the tolerance of minorities, tolerance of difference, tolerance of dissent, tolerance of the fact that people have the right to eat different foods, wear different clothes, believe in different gods, wear the hijab or not wear the hijab, carry the kirpan or not carry the kirpan, that intolerance has also increased. And so the Indian situation has become both more contradictory and more complex and complicated, and therefore possibly more confusing. And I'm sorry to be using alliterative C's all at the same time.
Yes, I mean, I think you also see this in the nature of the political debate, where you have apparently contradictory trajectories or narratives. So on the one hand, this idea that the current debate or the current sets of conflicts that are roiling Indian society have been long in the making, and they were just repressed for a long time. So, one of, as you know better than I, one of the claims of the BJP is that they've been unfairly repressed. The majority of Indian people and their concerns have been dominated by an anglicized Nehruvian elite, and finally they have a chance to manifest their voices and be heard. On the other hand, of course, there's the other claim, which is that all of this really, whatever its older precedents or history, becomes possible with liberalization, that there's this amazing coincidence with the liberalization of the Indian economy and Indian society at the very end of the 1980s, and the emergence of new kinds of politics. And Hindu nationalism is one of them, and certainly becomes the dominant one, but there is also caste politics, and there is regional state-based politics. And in some ways, the question is, why is it that Hindu nationalism wins out over the other two? And you have suggested that in a way it adopts the mantle of the national, given what seems to be the kind of falling by the wayside of a national opposition altogether. So I wanted to ask you two questions. One, how do you think liberalization, or do you in fact think that liberalization really transformed Indian politics? And secondly, whether caste is a weak reed when you think about re-democratization, and are we stuck with the federal structure as the only countervailing force to the kind of hollowed out democracy, technical democracy that you were just describing?
I think the economic liberalism that was ushered in the 1990s and taken further by every successive government right up till, and in fact, even at times continuing with Mr. Modi, has done three things that are very important. It has given an opening to the entrepreneurial spirit of the Indian people, allowing small entrepreneurs. I won't go so far as to claim, as Mr. Modi once ridiculously said, that even a pakoda wala is doing a job. I don't consider that an entrepreneurial job at all. But nonetheless, it has provided an opportunity for hundreds of millions to be able to access jobs, to be able to create jobs for themselves, to therefore improve their lives, and to also, in addition, to be able to travel the country to seek jobs. It's not that we've become like Tibet and we get on a bike and go, but nonetheless, we're not that far when you remember that something as many as 200 million Indians are migrant labor in their own country. That's an enormous number of people who, in search of opportunity, betterment, livelihood, have realized that if there isn't a job in Eastern UP or Bihar, there is one in Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Delhi. And that is a consciousness that is a direct result of the liberalization policies that have allowed small entrepreneurial enterprises and larger ones to be set up and people to migrate and move. That is a huge change, because that is not just providing employment, it's also providing a lifestyle experience that takes them away from their villages, opens their minds to a new urban environment, breaks some of the linkages to the caste and traditional bound habits that were ingrained in their villages, which entrapped them, and gives them a freedom to lead different lives with different mores and different traditions in urban India, often sometimes living side by side with people that they wouldn't even acknowledge as human beings in their villages. That is changing the way people think, which is why the thinking of urban India, in which I include the 200 million labor who come and work in urban India, is dramatically different to not just rural India, but also what I call small town India, which is the small towns that exist in between the Ghaziabads, the Aligarhs, the Lucknows, right? There is a huge change that economic liberalization has brought about, and it goes beyond the economic change. It's the lifestyle changes. On the other hand, the emergence of this belief that somehow Indians have been repressed is hugely exaggerated. There is no doubt that encouraging people to write in their language, speak in their language, pass exams in their language, opens up opportunities which otherwise were shut to them. And it's only right and proper that should happen. It's only natural and understandable that when Indian democracy deepened, which it had to, because it was very much a surface and thin soil during the first 20 years, it would flower by bringing to the fore the attitudes, the thinking, the mores, the traditions, the cultures of people who were considered earlier unimportant. And that is democratization, that is popularization, that was to be expected, it is to be cherished, and it is to be valued. But at the same time, convince those people that they were earlier repressed and now somehow they've been liberated, and they were repressed because they were being disregarded, is to make them feel that they were mistreated, that there is a second freedom being opened up for them. And that is a misinterpretation and a deliberate twist to a process that otherwise would happen in any democracy. If you look back over British history, right, the concept of societies being a small Victorian gathering of people has altered hugely. Society now is not Victorian in that sense at all. The language that is spoken is not the bespoke Queen's English. The people who now represent Britain in the media, on television, in sitcoms, in theater, right, are very different to those who were there in the 1880s, 1890s. That's a natural development. But in India, it's accompanied, sadly, particularly in the last 8 years, by a government attitude of saying that we're doing this and previously you were repressed. Now, let me give you just one example. Actually, English doesn't repress people. It opens their lives to opportunities that they would never have. India cannot communicate with itself without the English language. Northern India could, but the dialects of Hindi spoken in Northern India differ very substantially from Rajasthan to Maharashtra, from Bengal to Gujarat, right? Even within UP. English is a link language that unites not just the North and the South, the Northeast and the West, Kashmir and the East, but it also opens you up to a world where the caste distinctions that are inherent in the Indian language, and remember, the Indian language carries with it Indian culture, Indian thinking, Indian tradition, which English doesn't. The English language breaks free of that, which is why, I can't remember his name, but I think it's Chandrahas Mathur, actually today, as a Dalit philosopher, has deified the English language. And he says that the single most liberating things for Dalits is that the English language, when they get educated in it, breaks the barriers that are inherent in any Hindi or Indian language. So to represent English, therefore, as something that was repressive and held people back is to misunderstand the enormous opportunities it opens up itself, and also the fact that without it, we'd find it very difficult to function as a united country. We couldn't speak to each other. Tamilians do not want to speak in Hindi and refuse to learn it. There are very few people in North India who can understand a word of Tamil and anyway refer to them derisively as Madrasis. It's only when we break into English, and by the way, English is not an alien language, we've made it ours. The beautiful, fractured, broken, accented English we speak wins Booker Prizes. It won't be long before it wins Nobel Prizes. It's as much our language as it is yours. By yours, I mean British.
No, thank you for that, Karan. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, I'm always telling my colleagues and students here, especially those who are caught up in these debates in Britain and in America on decoloniality and such like, that they need to take more seriously what's happening in formerly colonized countries, where, you know, in situations where significant Dalit activists and intellectuals, as you remind us, are actually holding up, if you will, some elements of the colonial past, and certainly English, the English language, as a site which allowed them a kind of liberty they had not had before. And that puts our own debates in this country on decoloniality or decolonizing the university or curriculum in an entirely different light. But I'm afraid people here don't realize the vexed and complex nature of both colonialism and decolonization. But that aside, I've also been struck by how India's lack of a single language basically forces all national politics to be somehow in translation. And that, I think, is whether English is part of the translation or not, which, you know, I had always thought that you couldn't have a situation in India where one leader speaks, as Hitler did to his minions, in a language they all understand. And no leader can do that. And yet, even so, you have the emergence of a kind of authoritarian style and rhetoric. And I wanted to ask you about that. So, you know, leaving aside the specific Indian conditions for this, liberalization being one of them, can we also compare what's happening in India with what's happening globally? In fact, India might be ahead of the curve. As you described in your first response to me, you have a politician, in this case, the prime minister, who takes over his own party by force almost, eviscerates it of its existing establishment and elites and hollows it out, to use your terms. Surely it's something Mr. Trump did later to the Republican Party in the United States, and there are other examples in the West and elsewhere. So do you think, how might you situate what's happening in India with a kind of global return, if you will, of populism and authoritarian democracy?
Can I, with your permission, answer the second half of our question by making a comment on the first half?
Of course.
You struck me and you made me aware of something that I hadn't quite thought of in the way you phrased it. that so much of Indian politics happens in translation. And when you said that, the thought in my mind was, thank God for that. That is why Modi's influence in the BJP's reach stops at the borders of Bengal, at the borders of Tamil Nadu, at the borders of Kerala, at the borders of Andhra, at the borders of Telangana, at the borders of Orissa, and until very recently, at the borders of many of the northeastern states. That is sadly no longer the case. If that were not the case, the translation becomes a barrier to the communication of his thinking. And remember, translation is not just simply translating a language into another language, it's conveying the concepts, the culture, the tradition, the thinking that lies embedded in that language, that is sometimes silent and unexpressed, but understood by those who speak the language. All of that, translation is a barrier to. This is also why in the Hindi-speaking northern Indian hinterland, where one form or another of Hindi is understood, Mr. Modi literally sweeps the board. There are roughly 14, 15 states where his principal opponent is the Congress party, and he wins between 96 and 97% of the seats that he contests directly with them. It's a very different picture when translation becomes the barrier. So that translation barrier is actually a safety net that is at the moment containing the reach of Mr. Modi and also providing some opportunity for opposition forces, even if they are still regionally based, to put up a challenge against a one-man, one-party authoritarian rule. But the second part of your question was to do with that one-man, one-person, one-party authoritarian rule. And there I want to say something that perhaps I haven't said explicitly in this discussion so far. The most heinous, the most evil, and I'm deliberately using those words, I'm doing it consciously, not accidentally and not rhetorically. The most heinous and most evil thing that is happening is the deliberate attempt to appeal to 80% of Hindus, not just by emphasizing their Hindu character and by pretending that somehow their Hindu identity is in danger, but at the same time by demonizing the 14.2, 14.3% of Muslims as the other. You know, there are very few countries where we say of what must by now be 200 million people. There were, I think, 170 million when the census was done in 2011. I assume by now that figure is 200 million. That's my guess. There are no countries that I know of where the Home Minister refers to them as termites and does it repeatedly. There are no countries I know of where it's said of them derisively, "Ki tum Babur ki aulad ho." You are the descendants of a conqueror, Babur, and therefore you're not one of us. There is no other country where we say of them, if you don't like it, go to Pakistan. This is as much their home and their right as it is of any Hindu, any Jain, any Sikh, any Christian. But it's done because the idea is to create first a consciousness of division between Hindus and the rest, and then to capitalize upon it in political terms by pretending that Hindus are in danger and I'm your only savior, vote for me. Just look at the number of and the multitudinous number of ways in which Muslims are taunted. And the word taunt is a euphemism, by the way. We accuse them of love jihad. I've never heard of a more oxymoronic, meaningless term. We accuse them of cattle lynching. We complain about azan being played on mosques, but we don't worry when aartis are played on mosques at the same blaring volume. We accuse them of wearing hijabs for all sorts of reasons when there is no problem with young boys going to the same school with huge big Shaivite or Vaishnavite tikas across their forehead. We have no problem with Sikhs wearing turbans or even carrying kirpans on planes, which is conceivably actually dangerous because the kirpan is a weapon. But we have a huge problem if a young girl of 13 comes wearing a hijab to school. And we multiply these. Now in Karnataka, there is a problem in allowing Muslims to set up stalls around temple festivals, something they've been doing for 40, 50 years. This, worst of all, in December, from a Dharma Sansad, a religious parliament, I'll translate that term, of all wretched places, calls were heard for the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Muslims. Those calls were then repeated in other such gatherings. It took the police weeks to even arrest them. Shortly after they were arrested, Yati Narsinghanand, to name one of them, was released on bail on the condition he wouldn't do it again. And he did it not once, but twice, and the police haven't bothered to act, and nor have the courts. This is contempt of court, but the courts are silent. But worst of all, this is threatening the fabric, the unity, the harmony of my country. And there's utter deafening silence from the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, and every single member of the party. And when they speak, it's as if to justify what's happened, not just excuse, but to justify what's happened. And don't they realize that you cannot treat 200 million people in this way? We're playing with fire. I hate to speculate down that line, but you know what I'm hinting at. We're playing with fire. We could have violence. We could have civil war. People do not like being taunted and treated in this way. And then look what happened in Delhi and in Khargone, and it happened only 3 weeks ago, when there were communal riots. Let's not be euphemistic and use the term. Fortunately, they only lasted for a day or two. The response was to bulldoze the houses of Muslims who've been identified. And in the process, in Khargone, these are stories on the front page of the Indian Express, 3 young men who'd been in jail for 2 months and couldn't conceivably have participated in the riots, had their homes bulldozed. A woman, a widow, Harsina Farku is her name, whose house was built under the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana scheme, therefore it's legal. It was built with government money, was bulldozed. A young man whose arms were amputated both when he was a teenager, who was accused of stone pelting, and his house was bulldozed. And not a word of apology, not a word of regret, no talk of compensation or reparation. This happens regularly. We have forced our Muslim brothers and sisters to believe and think of themselves as second-class citizens in the land of their birth. This is the worst of what's happening in India. From time to time, the Western press pays attention to it. From time to time, the US Congress holds small sessions on genocidal rhetoric in India. But a lot more attention should be paid to this. I know that the West is deeply concerned about India's attitude to the Ukraine-Russian crisis. Frankly, I think some of the Western concern there is mistaken and can be easily rebuffed. Why doesn't the West instead, when they come to India, bring up this other issue about what you're doing to your Muslims? We beat around the bush when they beat around the bush when they come here. And you know why? Because this is a market of 1.4 billion and they don't want to lack access to investment. They don't want to find that export goods can't be sold here. It's a dreadful situation. And Mr. Modi knows that as he fails to revive the economy to the extent to which he's promised, I'm using my words carefully, to the extent to which he's promised, the way around it is to polarize and make Indians believe that without him, they're unsafe, they're threatened, right? To whip up nationalism, to whip up Hindutva, and the country blinds itself at times of voting by forgetting that necessity is around. Now, I'm not saying this is the only appeal Mr. Modi has. There is a lot else that he does that is genuinely very appealing, the welfare side of his policies. But I'm leaving that aside for this conversation. That sort of populism is common to America, it's common to countries in Europe, but it has a much worse divisive effect here because you're actually dividing people by religion. In Europe, you're simply appealing in populist genre, but not necessarily across religious divides. Here in India, you're appealing sharply across religious divides and you're polarizing them.
Well, thank you for that very somber assessment, which has brought up a great many points. Uh, and one might ask, for instance, how and why is it that people seem to be driven by resentment, or are they driven by resentment, to vote apparently against their own interests in the most recent set of elections, when even after the pandemic and its millions dead, and the appalling treatment of the migrant labor you were speaking about earlier, who had to trek back to their villages. They were literally expelled from their jobs in India's urban centers. Nevertheless, from the very regions which produced this migrant labor, you seem to have had this a strong showing of support for the government, and also, the question of religiously based discrimination and violence on the one hand, and what you haven't spoken about so much, caste-based violence on the other. But let me leave those questions in abeyance for the moment, because I see we have a few in the audience. Let me read a couple of them out. So we have Mehdi Askariye, who asks, I believe that the Indian press was somewhat independent. In the time of Mrs. Gandhi, she was given a hard time by the press. What has changed, and what have been the sources for this change?
The Indian press has gone through periods of remarkable, admirable, laudable independence. But when you use the phrase in the time of Mrs. Gandhi, I take it you mean Mrs. Gandhi, the elder Indira, not Sonia. Don't forget the emergency. From 75 to 77, this was a censored press. There was a very famous phrase used by Lal Krishna Advani at the time, which was very true. He says, you were asked to bend, you chose to crawl. And certainly the Indian press for those 2 years was craven. We cringed. However, at least that was an outright officially declared emergency in a censorship. What you have today is more invidious. And because it's more invidious, you could argue it's more worrying and disturbing. 3 sorts of things happen today. One, most channel owners and newspaper proprietors have multiple other business interests and can be not just lent upon, but sat upon by the government and be told quite clearly that if A and B continue to work for you, or if C remains your anchor, or if D is your columnist, then we will not like it, it will be unappreciated, and there could be, in quotes, implications for your other industries. It's never said quite as crudely, but that is clearly what is implied and understood. So that's one. And I'll give you a specific example to illustrate that before I go to the other 2. I know for a fact now that a company that sponsored the interview that I do for The Wire for 18 months, Glenlivet, was actually told specifically by the Commerce Secretary that the government didn't like the idea. And when it came time to renew the contract for another 3-month period, Glenlivet very embarrassedly explained the situation. And obviously they have other interests that they have to protect. Those are their prime corporate interests. But that is how the government behaves. You don't censor the media. What you do is you undercut their commercial advertising and commercial support. Or you get in touch with the proprietor and say, get rid of X and Y. It could have other implications if you don't. The second thing that happens is that you have television channels, and I'll happily name them, Republic, Times Now, to take just 2, and several in Hindi, who consciously have become mouthpieces and propagandist organs for the government because it gives them, A, more advertising from the government, and B, it gives them more access to government ministers, and they accept from the government spins on stories which otherwise would be deeply critical of the government, but instead they run the story in such a way that it seems as if the opposition or the alternative is to blame, not the government. That suits the government. In return, they get advertising, they get support, they get access to ministers. The third thing is that a lot of people have decided to draw in their horns and pull their punches. Look, journalists are not necessarily rich people. They need their jobs. And if what you do annoys your proprietor or you're lent upon by the government to get rid of you, then you'll find that your job could be at risk. And so people self-censor. And then, of course, there are other hideous things that happen. Sedition laws are brought into play because a journalist has tweeted a fact wrong. Sedition laws are brought into play because two young men, and this is a true story, 6 months or 8 months ago in the Northeast, said that it isn't true that Gav Mutra and cow dung are cures for COVID. Sedition laws are brought into play because people want to read the Hanuman Chalisa outside the Chief Minister's residence in Mumbai. Sedition is deeply threatening in India, and no one wants to end up in jail. Sadiq Kapur was done for sedition because he was traveling to write a story on the Hathras rape and never got to Hathras, leave aside write the story. But he was accused of sedition and he's been in jail for pretty close for 2 years without any relief. All of this together ensures that today you may not have the official censorship that you did in 75 to 77 during the Indira Gandhi emergency, but you have in some ways a situation which is more invidious, which seeps under your skin to change your thinking. So acts of defiance are few and far between. Let me give you an example. Yesterday, or was it the day before, a book was launched where probably most of the ambassadors had been invited and attended. And it's a collection of essays by people like the Home Minister, the Defense Minister, the National Security Advisor, and several other luminaries, not all of them politicians, each essay of which is dedicated to praise of the Prime Minister. I mean, to my eyes, that is gross, ludicrous, sickening sycophancy. I cannot imagine any other self-respecting democracy in the world where this would happen. I see frequent clips of how Boris Johnson is literally pulled apart limb by limb in interviews. One of which at least was done by Sky TV while he was briefly in India on Indian soil. It's unimaginable that our press would challenge our ministers in that way, leave aside in that tone.
Yes, it really is an extraordinary concatenation of events that we see in India, the chilling of debate, and all of which, of course, is through the use of the market mechanism rather than the instruments of the state directly, which takes us back to the point of liberalism. But I have a question from Mark Robinson, which is, my question is, what happens after Modi? Does the BJP have any succession planning? Could it implode? Will the Congress party fade away, or will the time come for a resurgence?
You know, that would be such a delightful question to answer if we could see the end of Modi in sight. The problem is the end of Modi, forgive me, let me correct myself. I mean, the political end of Modi is nowhere near in sight. I have a horrible sinking feeling, which with every passing day grows stronger and stronger, that he will win very convincingly the 2024 election. And Mr. Modi, anyway, he may have meant it jocularly, but he said so 2 days ago. At some function or the other, he said that a venerable elder politician of the opposition had come to him and said, you've achieved everything. You've been Chief Minister of Gujarat for 13 years, Prime Minister of India for 2 terms. What next? And he said he was astounded by that question. What do you mean, what next? His answer was, I'm born of Gujarat soil. I will continue. So I'm afraid the end of Mr. Modi is not in sight. That question, what next? Or if you remember Wells Hangen's famous question, after Nehru, who? It's far too early to ask that question now. It's a dream that I suppose we all have, that there may be someone and something. But let me assure you, I really don't believe the answer is Rahul Gandhi, or probably any Gandhi at all. I think one of the undeniable truths that Congress has not been able to accept, and certainly the Gandhis have not been able to accept, is that the extent to which Rahul Gandhi's credibility has been shattered, and I'm not saying shattered for the right reasons, but the fact of the matter is it has been shattered, means this phoenix cannot rise again. You cannot be popularly called Pappu, which is a sort of Indian nickname for a fond child, but it's also a derogatory term for referring to someone who's a dolt, a moron, and an idiot. You cannot be popularly called Pappu and then ever be voted to Prime Minister of the country. The two are impossible. Which is why my joke at the time of the 2019 election was that India had a choice between a moron and a monster.
In some ways, of course, being a Pappu is a much more appealing thing, because in some perverse way, it's linked to nonviolence. But that is precisely what is no longer seen as a characteristic of an Indian politician. They are meant to be.
Can I quickly interrupt and say, Faisal, one of the most successful politicians in India in terms of winning elections far, far ahead of Narendra Modi is called Pappu, Naveen Patnaik.
Yes.
Naveen Patnaik's nickname is Pappu. The country knows him as Pappu. He's won 4, if not 5 consecutive 5-term elections. And he is not even fluent in the language of the state, but he is beloved of that state. While Pappu lives, there will not be an alternate government.
Yeah, so the complexities are really fascinating. But let me go to Whit Mason, who asks, how do Modi's supporters regard his history with the RSS and through that his association with the assassination of Gandhi?
Well, there are some extremist members of Modi's wider support group, 1 or 2 of whom may also be members of the RSS, who look upon Gandhi's assassin as a hero. And there have been attempts made in some small towns to build temples to Nathuram Godse. That is one area where mercifully Mr. Modi has spoken out and criticized and condemned this. But the fact that, and by the way, one of those so-called worshippers, if I can so put it, of Nathuram Godse, is an MP in Modi's party. She beat Digvijay Singh in the last election. Her name escapes me now. She was also originally under charge and tried for one of the terrorist attacks. And I think either the case continues or she's been acquitted. But yes, it is not unknown, even if it is distasteful, that you would have people who consider the assassin of the father of the nation a hero. It's like literally considering Booth a hero in America, or Lee Harvey Oswald.
Let me move on to a question by William Crawley, who asks, aside from the barrier of language, to what extent has the BJP been successful in extending its influence and ideology across caste? Dalit voices are much more prominent than they used to be. Is this a constraint on the Hindutva lobby?
No, it's the other way around. One of the things that Mr. Modi has done is to attempt, and I'm using that word deliberately, to subsume caste divisions, particularly lower OBC divisions and lower Dalit divisions, under the Hindutva umbrella. He knows that the upper OBCs, who are called Yadavs, and the upper Dalits, who are called Jatavs, are very loyal in the first instance to the Samajwadi Party and in the second to Mayawati's Bahujan Samaj Party. But the non-Yadav OBCs and the non-Jatav Dalits are people who have voted in very sizable, if not overwhelming numbers for Mr. Modi, and they've done so under the umbrella of nationalism and under the umbrella of Hindutva. And therefore, to that extent, the caste divide that united people as members of a caste behind a particular party has been fractured, and in place has been brought an appeal in terms of nationalism and Hindutva. And I think I'm right in saying the figures are not at my fingertips, that Mr. Modi has by far the largest number of Dalit MPs in the Lok Sabha, by far.
And he is himself, of course, from not a traditionally upper caste. So, it's an interesting thing that's happening. And it goes back to one of the points I'd raised earlier in our conversation, that is caste a weak reed? Because you have a lot of people, anti-Hindutva people in India, who seem to think that we can somehow reinvigorate caste politics of the kind we had seen, a decade or so ago. But I'm not sure and you seem also to be somewhat doubtful of this possibility, which raises the question of where opposition is going to come from.
I'm certainly confident in saying that the reinvigoration of caste as a defining characteristic of politics in northern India or western India, those is diminishing. I am not so confident that is the case in southern India. I think caste is an important criteria in determining political choice and political decision making in Kerala, Telangana, Andhra, Tamil Nadu. But then remember, those are states, it may be equally important in places like Bengal, Orissa, but those are all states where Mr. Modi's influence is minimal and where the, I hate the word equalizing, but where the sublimating effect of Hindutva nationalism has been a lot lower. But I don't know the politics of those states as fluently, and they're not at my fingertips in the same way. So here, let me be honest and say that I'm expressing an initial opinion, and I would happily be corrected by someone.
Thank you. We have a question by Sandra Hausner, who says, I appreciate the clear and cogent description you give of the cultural dynamics of Modi's work to cultivate religious division. Could you return to the subtle point of how he increases a sense of Hindu vulnerability per se, such that he can offer himself as the savior, even though they constitute 80% of the population? Surely Modi is fomenting division not on the basis of Hindu vulnerability, but around the idea of so-called legitimate citizenship, belonging, etc. What kind of vulnerability were you suggesting Modi is exploiting?
I'm not sure I understand around the idea of the legitimacy of belonging. Is the questioner suggesting that what Mr. Modi is saying, that Muslims and Christians don't legitimately belong to India? That is inherent. Clearly, when Mr. Modi does two things, well, not Mr. Modi, Mr. Shah does the first, refers to Muslims as termites, as Ghuspetia, which means infiltrators. Of course, officially, he's only talking about people who cross the border from Bangladesh, but that terminology is used to subsume all Muslims. And it's clearly the case when we come up with the Citizen Amendment Act, which grants citizenship to persecuted minorities in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, who are of all religions, but not Muslim. And if we believe that there is a kinship to the people of these countries, then surely that kinship extends across all religions. The Ahmadiyas, by the way, a religion that originated on our side of the Punjab border, not the Pakistan side, are a persecuted, harassed minority. The Shias frequently are a persecuted and harassed majority. The Hazaras in Afghanistan, but none of them would be welcome in India. So part of Mr. Modi's response is conditioned by the belief that somehow Muslims are outsiders. He talks occasionally, not that often, but he has once or twice talked about what he calls 1200 years of slavery, which means that the entire Sultanate and Mughal period, right, is assumed to be a period when Hindus were slaves. We are going through a period at the moment where the chief of the Delhi BJP is determined to try and change the names of sarais, locations, villages, all in the Delhi area that have either Mughal or Sultanate connections, without realizing, as Narayani Gupta, the well-known historian, has pointed out, that the sarai was simply a point of rest between two places of travel. It wasn't actually created by the Mughals. That the word Pur, as in Baburpur, Timarpur, Humayunpur, doesn't mean that it's been named after the Emperor Babur or Timur. It's actually named after the beneficiary of a land grant. These are not therefore connected to the Mughals as emperors. But think logically for a moment. If it is so important to obliterate from Indian history Mughal emperors because they allegedly ill-treated and killed Hindus, then what about the Emperor Ashok, who by his own admission killed 100,000 people in what was it, 320 odd BC at Kalinga? And that was by his own admission. And the people he killed were Hindus. Why is the name Ashok permitted on Delhi roads? And if we want to change the name, because it hurts you, then are you also forgetting that cities are living entities, where the names are things people have grown up with and got used to and they're fond of and like? Proof of which is the Congress government tried desperately to change the name of Connaught Place to Rajiv Gandhi Chowk. Not a soul in this city calls it Rajiv Gandhi Chowk. Everyone affectionately calls Connaught Place CP, whether you're Hindi speaking or English speaking, and it will never change. So beyond exhibiting a terrible bias towards India's Muslim traditions, India's Muslim culture, India's Muslim heritage, right? There's nothing else that they're doing. But it's being done as a deliberate attempt to exacerbate the relationship between the two. Look, I'll give you another example. When the recent riots happened for a day and a half in Jamrudpur, was it, or Jamirpur? I've forgotten the name of the part of Delhi. It happened because the police deliberately allowed a Hindu Shobha Yatra with people brandishing swords and carrying knives in their hands to pass by a mosque. Now, anywhere else in the world, and in India in normal times, the police would have stopped it knowing this would be incendiary, it would inflame passions, you're inviting trouble. But when you allow that deliberately to happen, with the police standing by and watching, what are you doing and what message are you sending? That A, you don't care about the trouble that happens, and B, you're almost in support of it. Those are the subtle messages. They're not sent across in obvious, hateful terms. These are dog whistles, but they're heard loud and clear.
Thank you, Karan. As we come to a conclusion here, I just wanted to close by, leaving us with an entirely unoriginal thought, which is, on the one hand, we have a narrative of purely instrumental politics, where, as you say, the BJP is splitting castes from top to bottom, is sort of engineering society in such a way as to garner a majority on the basis of a Hindu identity. And on the other hand, there appears to be a non-instrumental or deeply felt sense of humiliation linked to the very kind of debates that we are having here in places like England on decolonizing institutions, universities, cultures, society, and all the rest. And it's the coming together of these narratives, one apparently on the left, the other on the far right, that is actually so disturbing. But disturbing for us, it has a different, in India, it looks like the far right is actually taking leaves from the book of the left in saying, yes, we need to decolonize, but we need to decolonize 1,200 years rather than 2 or 3. But that's a structural problem. Where does the deep sense of humiliation come from? Is it really an existential sense of humiliation? And how is it linked to the idea of instrumentality and of manipulation, which is what so much of Indian politics has conventionally been reduced to, that people are only doing things to win votes, and how those two come together is surely a crucial matter when thinking about the meaning and fate of democracy. But we have 1 minute left. Karan, I don't know if you would like to.
I'd like to take up that 1 minute very quickly. I just saw this, the first time in my life I've ever been able to read something on the screen, but it was the message from Camilla which said, lots of love to you, let's keep in touch. Lots of love to you from me, Camilla, too, and we'll definitely keep in touch. As soon as Faisal sends me your email, I promise I will write to you. And very, very quickly, in the 30 seconds left, I think there's an exaggerated fashion in my country, started unfortunately by a very dear friend of mine, Shashi Tharoor, who wrote a half brilliant and a half silly book on the Raj. The half brilliant bit was on the economic exploitation of the Raj, and all of that first half of the book is absolutely spot on and correct. The half wrong bit is where he claimed that so much that India today is proud of could have happened without the Raj. No, that's not true. Our democracy comes from the Raj. Our civil service tradition and the belief that they should be neutral comes from the Raj. Our courts come from the Raj, particularly our jurisprudence and many of the principles that underlie our constitution. Our army, its neutrality, its training, and its history and its traditions come from the Raj. And let me tell you, our army is very proud of those traditions. Our civil service, I've already mentioned. Our language comes from the Raj. Without the English, we'd be talking, we would be a Tower of Babel. So I'm using Shashi's book only because he's a dear friend and he'll know that I don't mean any ill will to him. But the first half of the book was brilliant. But there's a lot of unnecessary knocking off the British rule that we need to rethink. It's become fashionable to do so, but it is actually based on lack of knowledge and even bias.
With that, it remains for me to thank you very much, Karan Thapar, for joining us today. I think we've had a really stimulating set of remarks from you on, of course, we could spend hours and days on this subject, but in the time that was allotted to us, I think it's been a wonderful experience. And I'll turn over to Wouter to close with a vote of thanks.
First of all, if there is anyone who wants to reconnect with another Antonian, please do get in touch with the development office. We are more than happy to put people with each other in contact. That's certainly one thing that we can do. But thank you, Faisal and Karan. That was fantastic. I certainly learned a lot. And I hope, Karan, that you will pay us a visit at some point to St. Anthony's so that we can meet you in person. But before you all go, I wanted to make use of the opportunity to tell you about a new initiative that we are taking at St. Anthony's, and that is for a new scholarship that will be for students from the Global South that are underrepresented in Oxford. And we aspire to offer a new scholarship to students who have completed their undergraduate degrees in countries that receive official development assistance. So not students who did their undergraduate degrees at fancy universities in the UK or the US, but who actually did their first degree in the Global South. This initiative was actually taken by current students, and they were pushing the development office and the college to go for this. And we are very happy to take part in this initiative. And it would be wonderful if you are able to donate to this new scholarship at a level you're comfortable with. And I will make sure to follow up in the next few days for all the details. Thank you again for joining us. Antonians, please do feel free to visit the college. You're entitled to have a free high table, so please make sure to make use of that. Thanks everybody for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.